And it's a little too much to cover, I'm sure, in an hour, so I'll probably skip some of it. But, well, let me start. In my first talk, I tried to do two things: to introduce political philosophy of technology as a technological political problem analogous to what Leo Strauss called the theological political problem. And two, to begin to consider Alasdair MacIntyre's moral philosophy through the eyes of the technological political problem. Today, reflecting the way in which philosophy, especially political philosophy, repeatedly and naively entails a return to beginnings, and in light of discussions generated by the first talk, I want to reiterate both themes briefly, and then advance our discussion by drawing again on Strauss. So once again, the theological political problem can be stated as follows. Absent revelation, that is, in the natural human condition, even people who believe in revelation think that it's transformed the natural condition. So it's unnatural to believe in revelation. Absent revelation, human action and political order are shot through with recognized fallibility, qualification, and contingency, even failure, suffering, sadness, and tragedy. Under the conditions created by a belief in divine revelation, human action and political order become infused with an authority or certainty that tends toward the fanatical, even ideas of divine mission and supernatural post-mortal life. Millennialist movements such as the Taiping Rebellion illustrate the phenomena. It's very hard to argue with somebody who thinks they're representing God. It is difficult for politics to know how to respond to or handle revelation-based political behavior. The technological political problem exhibits the same basic structure. Absent modern engineering-based technology, human technical activities are limited in their power, reach, and consequences, so that human action and political order don't have to pay all that much attention to material culture. Simple example: swords and guns do not kill thousands of people and disrupt the natural environment, both at once and over extended periods into the future, the way nuclear weapons do. But under conditions of modern technology, politics assumes or has imposed on it extreme needs to manage material culture, as well as social order, greater than anything experienced in previous human history. Additionally, modern technology gives rise to a new kind of technology-based millennialism, or techno-optimistic utopianism, if not techno-fanaticism. And it's difficult for politics to know how to respond to or handle technology-based behavior. Any adequate applied ethics of science, engineering, and technology must take this problem into account. Turning now to MacIntyre. Let me begin with a note on what he means by practice. Since Professor Wang Guoyu raised this question, and I thought she was absolutely right, and so I spent a lot of time sort of digging into it, and I'll share with you part of this. It's a term that's ubiquitous in his text, but only late in the game does he develop a clear definition. And when he does so, it is a little at odds with earlier of his own uses. But it took me digging to sort this out. If we look at the index, it's always a good place to begin, provided you've got a good index. It doesn't even appear there. Practice is not in the index. The closest is practical reasoning, with 4 multi-page references. So I looked up each of the 4. The first reference is in chapter 3. And the term practicing reasoning itself does not actually occur. So the term is now practical reasoning, not practice. And in the first reference, not even that term occurs. But he is talking about it. And this is an indication right away that we had a good indexer. a poor indexer just looks up words and doesn't try to read the text and see how it might really be relevant to the topic. So this is a good index. It's one we can have some faith in. The second reference in chapter 4, the predecessor culture and the Enlightenment project, this passage deals with Kant's argument in the critique of practical reason about the right way to reason or think about practice instead of knowledge, as in the critique of pure reason. So here, practice is opposed to knowledge and is a Kantian term for human action. The third reference in chapter 12, Aristotle's account of the virtues, in which he argues that Aristotle's account of practical reasoning is in essentials surely right. For Aristotle, McIntyre notes, quote, the conclusion to a practical syllogism is a particular kind of action. So again, practice just seems to be a synonym for action. The fourth reference in chapter 15, the virtues, the unity of the human life, and the concept of tradition, is the longest passage, appears to confirm practice as simply another word for action. I'll leave you to read the quotation. This sentence reminds us of the opening sentence of the Nicomachean Ethics. In the widely used W.D. Ross English translation, every art and every inquiry, and similarly every action and pursuit, is thought to aim at some good. The word translated as action is praxis, which could equally well be translated as practice, which is the way Marx would probably have translated it. And art is Ross's translation for techne. In Marx, however, at least in the thesis on Feuerbach, praxis, the Greek word is used as a German word, means both making and doing. And I give you the thesis on Feuerbach, thesis 1, both in German and in English. Let's skip to the English. The capital defect of all materialism up till now, Feuerbach's included, is that the object, the actuality, sensibility, is grasped only under the form of the object or of intuition, but not as sensibly human activity, practice or praxis, not subjectivity. So the word that in this English translation that I'm using, praxis, is translated as practice. And this means that praxis in Aristotle, action in W.D. Ross translation, and practice in Marx's translation are all the same thing. Praxis for McIntyre refers in the first instance and most clearly to action, human action. There are at least two observations that can be made about praxis or practice in this sense. First, action or practice must be conscious. People have to think about what they're doing or making. Simply breathing and turning oxygen into carbon dioxide is not an action. It's simply biological metabolism or functioning. Second, routinized behavior is not action or practice either. Hannah Arendt in The Human Condition makes a big point about this by differentiating between labor, routinized making or doing, work, constructive activity or techne, and action into the web of human relationships or human affairs. She also notes the distinctiveness of engineering technology, that it is action not into the web of human relationships, but into nature, the web of physical reality outside of us. Now here again, my concern about McIntyre's slighting of technology comes up. In his extended discussion of the Nicomachean Ethics, McIntyre fails to call attention to Aristotle's distinctions between making, poiesis, doing, praxis, practice, action, most significantly political action for Aristotle, and thinking, noesis. In Book 6, Aristotle describes several intellectual as opposed to moral virtues, or we say virtues of character, virtues of the intellect or virtues of character. Techne, skill in making, episteme, knowledge, and phronesis, the capstone virtue of praxis. In the Nicomachean Ethics is concerned with the ethics, meaning the philosophical account of good actions or character as distinct from behavior. As far as I know, Aristotle never discusses the ethics of poiesis or techne. Recall that central to Heidegger's question concerning technology are distinctions between three types of becoming: phusis, poesis, and technic. Aristotle could legitimately ignore poesis and techne because it was political or interpersonal action that was of the most consequence in human affairs, and making, or technics, had a relatively reduced impact on both the human and non-human natural worlds. However, when MacIntyre does come to give a clear definition of practice, he implicitly includes some types of making. See a non-indexed passage at 187, 188, where he admits that his definition, quote, does not completely agree with current ordinary usage, including my own previous use of the word. So he's now saying, see, this is late in the text. This is now in the penultimate chapter. He's getting a different definition which builds on the first one that includes all kinds of action. Not behavior, but action. And then quote, this is the crucial quote. By praxis, I am going to mean any coherent and complex form of socially established cooperative human activity through which goods internal to that form of activity are realized in the course of trying to achieve those standards of excellence which are appropriate to and partially definitive of that form of activity, with the result that human powers to achieve excellence and human conceptions of the ends and goods involved are systematically extended. Wow, that's one hell of a definition, right? So in a way, we could say that it sort of like includes all of Aristotle's four causes, into a package here. Then he gives some examples. Tic-tac-toe is not an example of a practice in this sense, nor is throwing a football with skill. But the game of football is. So is chess. So it's now in the earlier usage, the decision of the quarterback to throw the ball in a skillful way is an action. He's thought about it. He's figured it's the right action in this particular place in the game, in this particular event, but it's not a praxis. What's the praxis is playing football. Practice, I'm sorry, I keep slipping into using the Greek. Practice, but the game of football is. So is chess. Bricklaying is not a practice. Now, the earlier definition would be, laying bricks is something you have to think about. It's routinized, that's true, bricklayers, but they get skills that allow them to lay bricks. And bricklaying is a skill. I've done it. I don't do it very well. If you look at the walls that I've laid with brick, they're kind of wobbly. Architecture is a skill, is a praxis, a practice. Just excuse me, I can't do this right. Planting turnips is not a practice, farming is. So are the inquiries of physics, chemistry, and biology. And so is the work of the historian. So are painting and music. And so is, although he doesn't say it, philosophy. Philosophy is a practice. Ethics is a practice. Morality may not be a practice because people behave morally just from social pressure and in routinized way. So in this sense, just behaving morally may not be a practice. But thinking about it, ethically reflecting on what you do is a practice. And thinking about this, actually after meeting the three of you and realizing that you're working on, that the center, this institute, is working on how to institutionalize the practice of the ethics of science and the ethics of engineering. I think it's in this way that MacIntyre can be informative and can be useful for thinking about how we cultivate ethical scientists, ethical researchers, and ethical engineers, rather than just following a code in some routinized way. McIntyre now, in this passage, de-individualizes practices in a way that his usages did not. He makes them part of a tradition. This becomes the crucial move for McIntyre. My criticism of McIntyre in regard to technology is not so much that he is incoherent. That's McIntyre's own favorite criticism of his sociological, philosophical interlocutors, but inadequate. So I don't claim that McIntyre is incoherent. I think he's quite coherent, but I think he's inadequate. He doesn't go far enough. He doesn't include enough. His observation that moral discourse regarding three contemporary issues, how to treat nuclear weapons, abortion, and healthcare, is incoherent. His observation that this discourse is incoherent, the modern discourse about the ethics of nuclear weapons, abortion, and healthcare is incoherent. That's McIntyre's claim. Is not itself incoherent, but it's incomplete insofar as it does not thematize the distinctive engineering and modern technological-based character of these issues. Finally, a note about McIntyre's Marxism. I mentioned last time that McIntyre self-describes not only as Aristotelian and Thomist, or Thomist Aristotelian, but also as Marxist. I also mentioned that a formative experience for McIntyre was the failure of socialism. More accurately, I should have said the failure of English-speaking or British socialism. We must remember, as the contemporary Marxist Confucian philosopher Li Ziho has argued, Chinese Marxism is not the same as Marxism in China. In other words, Marxism finds different expressions in different national contexts, just as capitalism does. McIntyre was, in the 1940s and 1950s, an active card-carrying member of the Communist Party of Great Britain, the CPGB, which was founded in 1920 and was succeeded by the Communist Party of Great Britain, the CPB, in 1988, and is still active as a member of left coalitions. So the CPB exists as a strong political party, often allied with the Labour Party in England today. There are as well, in fact, the previous leader of the Labour Party has been ostracized partly because of his close association with the CPB. There are as well, it should be noted, communist parties of smaller or larger sizes in all European countries and even in the United States. That is, the Communist Party of the United States of America, CPUSA, founded in September 1st, 1919, has office currently at 235 West 23rd Street, New York. When I had a conversation with somebody from here I don't think they're here today, after class, and he couldn't believe there was a Communist Party still alive in the United States today. Now, it's not very big, and it's not very powerful, but it exists. Afterward, I was asked by one of the participants to clarify in what sense McIntyre could be a Marxist. Here again, I repaired to the index. In the index of After Virtue, there are almost as many references to Marx, 11, as to Aquinas. Quite amazing, right? References to Aristotle and Kant, McIntyre's bête noire, overwhelm all the others. Here are three pertinent quotations from the set of references to Marx. Now I'm going to let you read those if you want to. To fully appreciate McIntyre's Marxism, one would need to consult, I should have said, he resigned from the CPB in the 1950s. Well, it was still the CPGB at that time. He resigned in the 1950s. To fully appreciate McIntyre's Marxism, one would need to consult at least his two books on Marxism and his important paper, The Theses on Feuerbach, A Road Not Taken, 1994. This is a clear, very clear statement of what he takes to be the insights that he thinks are true and are still needed from Marx. But in simplified terms, what McIntyre draws from Marx to complete Aristotle and Aquinas is the distinction between economic base and socioculture superstructure and the importance of base, or, in McIntyre's terms, the necessity of relating philosophy to sociology. But McIntyre's sociology is behind the times. He does not engage with the sociology of the technological society. That's my criticism of McIntyre. Okay, that's all the introduction. Let me take a breath of fresh air here. Any questions at this point?
Actually, I do have a question.
Okay, go.
You mentioned about the distinction between practice and action. I totally understand.
Yeah.
I agree. But you also take an example. You said morality is not a practice.
Yeah.
Behaving
Behaving moral is not a practice.
moral is not a practice.
Yeah.
I totally understand. I understand that like if somebody is a psychopath
Yeah.
and he acts
Yeah.
like that way, of course it's not immoral. But morality itself, like, probably contains not just the action.
Okay,
moral action,
all right. Maybe I overstated the case. Right. What I want to do is distinguish between, at least in English, we talk about morals and ethics. And ethics is the conscious reflection on morals. But morals is just sort of inherited. It's what, you get punished if you tell lies by your mother and your father, right? If you don't do good in school, you get rewards withdrawn, and so you learn. It's just a stimulus response. You learn to behave in certain ways, which in a global way we sometimes describe as moral. But that's not really a praxis or a practice. You're not developing skills for applying, knowing when to tell the lies and when to tell the truth. I mean, telling the truth is much more complex than it's just always say exactly what is. I remember a case in my own life. Some of you have probably had the similar kind of thing. Your mother tells you never tell lies. A used salesman comes to the door and he asks, is your mother home? And you say, yes, she's here. Your mother gets mad at you. You told him he's here. I don't want you to tell him I'm here. I don't want to talk to the salesman. So you discover that, I'm supposed to tell lies to the salesman, but I'm not supposed to tell lies to my mother. And so it has to be defined. And that takes time, developing that and thinking about it. Just, not telling lies is not a praxis. Does that make sense?
Sure, yeah.
Okay. But good question. More? Yeah.
I also got a question from that reference exactly. From page 7. That time, he giving the example like take a tool. It's not an example of practice, but no is throwing the football, but the game of football is.
Yeah.
So, firstly, I would like to think that is he emphasize that throwing the ball or someone fetching the ball is not playing by the rule. There's no rules, and playing a football game is kind of like a Wittgenstein's idea. But soon I realized it's not. I don't know. I just cannot tell the difference between take a two and a football game. They're all games, right, with the rules.
Yeah. It's another good question. McIntyre thinks that a practice has to have a history and be part of and be a narrative. There has to be a story. Just throwing the football, I think, again, I need to correct myself. When the quarterback determines that this is the right time to throw the football and throws it skillfully, that's part of a praxis because he's playing the game well. If he's not in the game, but he's just playing with his son, and he throws it very skillfully, that's not a practice because it's not part of the game. Now, if he's in spring training and learning to throw it well and working with his team members, that's again part of the practice. But it has, and the game has a history of being played over and over at different times of the year, played season after season, going through modifications as members of the team change, as the different teams play different, as teams play different teams and learn different skills. So a practice is a piece, a practice as a single action to be a practice in the rich sense. Let's call it the thin and the rich sense of practice. To be part of a practice in the rich sense has to have a global context, and I think it would even have to be done with other people and have a tradition.
I think the global context may be a bit too strong, but I get your idea.
Yeah.
Like, I don't know if I can modify this football case. Like, if I just pass the ball, like, being really professional, like, just doing the passing, you know, like I just playing football with you. Without telling you, I was playing with you, and someone just fetched the ball. Stop the ball, like we were playing a football game, and then the practice is legitimate because we are doing that without saying anything about.
Oh yeah. Okay. Yeah, I think you're right. I think even with this extended, excessively verbal definition, the notion of practice is still a little fuzzy. But I think he wants it that way because he thinks human experience can't be chopped up very cleanly. We need to chop it up. We need to divide things, but we need to recognize that something like practice and something like being good and something like doing philosophy can have fuzzy borders too. And one of the things that philosophy is for is to help us distinguish at those fuzzy borders. And that's what he's trying to do when he continues with this definition to then add that practice is part of a tradition. Okay, good points all. All right. Now, the second half is a very different kettle of fish, as they say in English. And that's because I'm trying to do too much. All I can do is apologize. We'll start with this and see what happens. I am not a Straussian. But I have been significantly influenced by his work. In the first instance, through a teacher who was one of his less well-known students. Clark Boughton did his PhD under Strauss with a dissertation on Jean Bodin's theory of sovereignty, a concept deeply entrenched with the modern engineering-dependent nation-state. So Boughton was my Rosen. Falling in between Machiavelli and Hobbes, Bodin was not as great as either, but he was the first to define the state clearly and simply in terms of centralized power, and thus to make sovereignty a pivotal concept of modern political science. As he put it in his 6 books of the Republic, 1576, the state is constituted by any government of multiple households and that which is common to them with sovereign power. So once you have a group and its states are made up of households or families and everything that's common to them that they hold together, and that there's some central power that controls everything ultimately, that sovereignty creates a state. a definition that covers any human association from tribe to empire, so long as there exists an ultimately dominating power. See, because Aristotle's definition of a state, the polis, does not include like a tribe, for instance. The concept of the unitary executive, in the name of which modern technology is often deployed, originated with Fudan. The Unitarian executive refers to a fraught discussion in the United States today, whether the president has the power to suspend the laws. Trump argued that he did. So did some members of his Supreme Court. Although originally and primarily a political concept, sovereignty cannot help but invite as well the thinking of modern technology, the engineering dynamic from which it arises, and its progressive, not to say aggressive, sovereign power in our progressively engineered and engineering world modernity. Indeed, my hypothesis is that the emergence of political sovereignty has gone hand in hand with an emergence of technological sovereignty, that the two forms of sovereignty have been mutually reinforcing, and that the political philosophy of Strauss can help us appreciate this happening. Engineering and technology are not simply instruments available to use by the nation state. They are constituting elements. My argument, however, will be less straightforward than a more reflective, episodic, and somewhat circular invitation to thinking that draws, sometimes directly, sometimes indirectly, on Strauss. It will be using Strauss to help us try to catch sight of something otherwise missing in philosophical discourse on engineering and technology. It's divided into 5 unequal parts. The first part, cities, empires, and nation states. Prior to the modern period, the two most well-defined post-tribal political orders were cities and empires. Cities circumscribed by walls, and empires with indefinite boundaries anchored in a metropole. Fudan criticized Aristotle's conception of the human association inscribed in a city in terms of human flourishing rather than power as lacking generality. Sovereignty, as a simpler concept, trumps flourishing in universality. The ultimate ineffectiveness of walls for protecting human flourishing from external assaults of power, as well as establishing imperial boundaries, was discovered by both Roman and Han emperors, although the Chinese stuck with barrier techniques longer and were slightly more successful. But the nation state would require a new kind of technology. In city-states, the question of sovereignty as such did not arise, and within traditional empires, its ultimate diffusion had to be accepted as a given. Even in the metropole, an emperor, whose semi-sovereignty derived originally from crime and conquest, ruled from high above and far away, through allies and court officials who vied with one another for access and influence. Diffusion only increased as the empire expanded into the provinces. In order for an agriculture-dependent despotism to produce the wealth of arms and artifice required to drape dynastic kingships, a realm had to rely on social ontological differentiations that included peasant families exercising some measure of subsidiary autonomy. Empires further exhibit temporal declines across a systole and diastole that is invoked by the opening sentences of the Chinese classic Romance of the Three Kingdoms. The empire long divided must unite, long united must divide. Thus it has ever been. Within the confines of city walls, even more so, powers are multiple, more or less obvious, and able to be exercised by all citizens. Citizens being a name for the power-holding elite who govern through the agonistic outcomes of their interactions. As Aristotle saw it, the city, as city, presents citizens to each other synoptically, thereby enabling agonistic deliberation. In other words, in the city, in the classic city, you can see everybody that you live with. The nation state, you're not going to come into visual contact with but a very, very, very small segment of the population. In the polis, you see everybody, and you have some kind of first or second-hand knowledge of everybody, so that when you try to vote for who's going to be the leader, you don't have to vote. You don't get persuaded just by propaganda. You have some knowledge of whether that guy is really what he says he is, either directly because you know him directly, or you know somebody who knows him, or you know somebody who knows somebody who knows him. 3 removed was what Aristotle wanted, no more than 3 removed. As Strauss describes it, echoing Aristotle, the city-state is the complete association which corresponds to the natural range of human power of knowing and loving. You can't love somebody. I mean, we say we love, Americans say they love all Americans. Come on, what does that mean? It's either true but trivial, or it's false. But you can love everybody in the polis because it's a limited group. This is part of the problem with friends on Facebook and WeChat, right? What are these friends? No instrumental medium or mediation is required to bring people together. At the same time, the city is a site of passions, echoing and intensifying through its infighting the passions inside an imperial court, as citizens vie with one another through words and deeds to stand out and influence others. According to the classics, cities too exhibit natural recyclings of democracy, monarchy, aristocracy, oligarchy, democracy, and tyranny. According to Polybius, a strong influence on Montesquieu, who in turn influenced James Madison, who drafted the United States Constitution, what is best is a mixed regime of monarchy, aristocracy, and democracy. Best, however, in the distinctly modern sense of creating the most stable, individualist-based order or atomistic social ontology, prescinding from arguments about what may constitute flourishing. The social binding in any political order, including city-states, nevertheless includes, at least for Baudin, autochthonic and mythic elements. That's something, see, that China has that the United States doesn't. There's no autochthonic base in the United States. There's no mythic base in the United States. The myths are all sort of created, or, I mean, they're very artificial, or they're imported from abroad. They're not local. The ones that are local are those of the American Indians, and we've successfully killed all of them. So they're not able to contribute that to the country. The modern nation state is something different. It's larger than a city, but not as great as an empire. It takes in a geographically extended but well-bounded territory, ruled by means of a consciously constructed sovereignty in the name of a community of citizens sharing an ethnic or cultural identity, but not personal contact, that grants the government sole legitimate use of force. Differing from city and empire, it manifests what might be called exposed sovereignty, akin to what was no more than implicit or less executively defined in a city, across a miniature empire. Its mythic element is also different, resting in historically contingent new conditions created by Abrahamic revelation religions, especially Christianity. In other words, I'm arguing that Christianity especially made possible the nation state by creating associations of individuals on a basis something other than personal association. It's because God loves all these different people that then they can be in the same community. God loves them all, and they're supposed to love each other, but they don't have to know each other. The nation state becomes increasingly dependent on engineering and modern technology. Boundaries need to be surveyed and enforced. stimulating new forms of administrative engineering, including the monitoring and policing populations, as analyzed by Foucault. Additionally, in order to assert power, whether monarchical, managerial, or democratic, throughout the territory, power that would otherwise be weakened according to a sociological version of the inverse square law. In other words, the further away you are from the government, then the less the government can control you. Sovereignty must be affirmed and asserted by means of engineered systems of transport and communication. The most consequent of technologies, however, are those of mechanical, chemical, and electrical engineering combined in mass industrial production. Nation states and Abrahamic religions. Let me elaborate on two claims that might be questioned. The first concerns the idea that the presence of Abrahamic revelation religion is a distinctive contributor to nation-state sovereignty. The most obvious connection is the dogma of divine sovereignty in revelation religion. Judaism, Christianity, and Islam all proclaim the absolute power of one true God, omnipotence, omniscience, with power to save or damn every human being, conceived in radically individualist, egalitarian terms. Insofar as humans are created in the image and likeness of such a God, they, or at least their kings, cannot help but aspire to exercise some diminished version of such sovereignty, that is, autonomy. As images of God, they naturally aspire to imitate Him. In pre-modern political orders, whether cities or empires, sovereignty was also intertwined with myths about transcendence or immortals and divinities. The Chinese emperor was a son of heaven. Pharaoh was a divine being, as was Caesar. In Israel, however, God ceased to take human form, and a split occurred between kings and prophets. And prophets of God were deputized with a divinely sanctioned oppositional stance toward kings or any other political authority. Roman Christianity codified this in the institutional power of a hierarchical church that split the social order into two authorities, secular and spiritual, with the spiritual remaining informally subdivided into ecclesiastical and monastic. I'm sorry, not monarchic. Okay, the point is that in classic Judaism, Moses was a prophet and the ruler. But when other kings replaced Moses, they ceased to be prophets, and a separate order or role was given to prophets who could oppose the king. So this is something that didn't happen. It can't happen until you get this kind of bifurcation in the polis. There's lots of competition, but you don't have two different groups claiming that they have authority from God, from a supernatural power to be rulers. So this creates an impossible tension that plays out for centuries, for 2,000 and more years in Christianity. In pre-modern political orders, whether cities or empires, oh, well, I already got that. Competition and struggle for sovereign power became a norm of European political life, which, with the Reformation, turned into extensive domestic and interstate rivalries, ultimately to violence and internecine warfare. The problematic of this almost nihilistically destructive violence, with its roots in Christian fanaticisms about absolutist revelations, became a significant theme in political philosophy from Marsilius of Padua and Machiavelli through to Baudin and on to Francis Bacon, a problematic that only began to be tamed by formulation of a politics of national sovereignty at the Peace of Westphalia in 1648. Now, again, this is not just history. Right now, ever since 1949, with the founding of the People's Republic has been in conflict with the Roman Catholic Church. The church claims, the Roman Catholic Church and the Pope claim that they have the right to appoint the archbishops and the bishops, and President Xi now, and whoever was chairman before, claimed the right that they get to appoint the local heads of the patriotic Catholic Church. And this is not just something that China's developed. It was present in England during the Middle Ages. When Charlemagne was crowned king, the question was whether the Pope could crown him king, and therefore the Pope was the person who declared him king, or Charlemagne could crown himself, right? The Pope was going to do it. The Pope said, he wanted to do it, and Charlemagne grabbed the crown and put it on his own head to assert, he wanted to appoint then all the bishops in France and Germany at that time. So this kind of problematic has been just replete in Western history. Okay, third section. Pierre Manet on the nation state. Allow me to reference here a reading by Pierre Manet, a leading French reader, but Ramon Aron tutored critical reader of Strauss. According Ramon Aron is I would say he was a political journalist, but the foremost non-existentialist political thinker in France until his death after the Second War, until about 1980s when he died. And Manet was his research assistant. According to Manet, 2, the nation is something in between city and empire, a, quote, unique political form proper to Europe, since it was produced by a complex of circumstances and purposes exclusive to it and its American offspring. This new political form was needed to mediate between city and empire under historical conditions created by a competing third, the church. The church was a new social order, differing from both city and empire. This historical creation, and quote here, a further word, I'll leave that quotation because it sort of says what I already said. The Christian kingdom is more acceptable to the church than either city or empire. Citizens in cities are, quote, carried away by passions that make them forgetful of their souls, while an emperor aims at a plenitude potestatis that necessarily rivals that of a pope. So what happened was initially the Roman Empire falls and the church tries to take charge of the Roman Empire and make it a Christian empire. But this doesn't work, and the empire falls apart into various kingdoms, which then the Pope, as the head of the church, tries to rule as separate kingdoms, and he likes that better than having to compete with an emperor, or having an emperor who would be the same as the Pope. By contrast, the Christian king, ruling a limited territory with sovereignty that Baudin conceived as founded in divine right, could dispose subjects to obey the law of God and the injunctions of the church within geographical confines that promoted effectiveness superior to any emperor or pope for that matter. Conversely, this king, because of his sovereign marshaling of a large population, was in a position to defend the prerogatives of the secular domain against encroachments by the church. Blessed by the church, it was nevertheless a king rather than bishop who commanded armies. Yet along with his divine kingship came a new challenge, political fanaticism, greater than anything characteristic of the pre-Christian city. It was in response to this challenge that first Machiavelli, then Hobbes, sought to undermine and secularize the Christian kingdom. One further word on Christian fanaticism. Well, I'm going to skip that. That just says you find fanaticism everywhere. It's just greater in Christianity, in cultures influenced by Christianity than elsewhere. And I'll skip the Thomas Aquinas quote there too. The let's go on to section 4. But basically, I argue that the clash of civilizations is real, primarily because of Christianity. Because of Christianity in Islam, this is not true of Judaism. Judaism does not claim universality. Judaism claims particularity. So it's not in conflict with everybody else and everybody who believes anything else. But Christianity and Islam are in conflict with, in principle and potentially, any other state. It doesn't matter which one. And for that reason, there is a clash of civilizations, certainly between Christianity and Islam, and in potency between Christianity, Islam, and any other broad, philosophical-like, religious-like bonding of a people, like Confucianism. A second question concerns my claim that engineering, technology, and mass productive industrialization as consequential elements in the theory and practice of bourgeois sovereignty. Machiavelli's core teaching, according to Strauss, constituted a lowering of the standards in political philosophy. In classical political thought, the standard for judging political orders was a propensity for cultivating and supporting virtuous lives. This is McIntyre. He's right. This was the case not only in Greek and Roman political orders, but also in classical Islamic and medieval Jewish political theory. It was even the case, although only glancingly acknowledged by Strauss, in Chinese political thought. Machiavelli attacked classical political philosophy for taking its bearings from idealistic, imaginary fictions about the ways people live. The masses, especially the masses to which the church offered spiritual escape from suffering, are decisively moved, not from above by aspirations to virtue, understood in a noble sense, but from below by attempts to escape the scarcities and depredations of this life, including the crushing consequences of greed and power. Machiavelli, therefore, argued for a transvaluation of virtue, from cardinal and theological narratives emphasizing harmony with the good, to virtue as the power to take control of fortuna, where and whenever she appears, and to bend her to one's will by whatever means available. It is not difficult to recognize what a small step it is from Machiavelli to Bacon, and a theory of knowledge as power aimed at the conquest of nature for the relief of man's estate. In Bacon's New Atlantis, advisors to the prince, if not the prince himself, become scientist engineers. Their new aim, the relief of the human condition, after conceptual maturation in Hobbes and Locke, eventuates in the self-assertion of English-speaking engineering as, quote, the art of directing the great resources of power in nature for the use and convenience of man, to quote the 1828 founding charter of the Institution of Civil Engineers. That is, in the ideal of bourgeois engineering sovereignty, the sovereignty of capitalist commerce and technology. For Machiavelli, of course, the lowering of the standards was not a lowering at all. Machiavelli presented it as a raising of the standards, in the sense that it was more in line with reality and thus able to offer practical guidance for any prince who would create a new political order, especially one from the disordered society of early 16th century Italy, which existed, quoting Machiavelli, without head, without order, beaten, despoiled, torn, and overrun. Machiavelli was particularly incensed by the Christian legacy that could simultaneously emasculate secular sovereignty by subjecting it to spiritual oversight, while endorsing secular practices of pious cruelty to enforced doctrinal purities. Pious cruelty to enforced doctrinal purities. The full-scale civil and national wars of religion, which broke out 3 years before Machiavelli's death, intensified philosophical efforts to defang Christian religious fanaticism, as in the biblical criticisms advanced by Hobbes and then by Benedict Spinoza's Tractatus Theologico Politicus. There's a sense, however, in which the theological fanaticism of Abrahamic revelation religion is mirrored in if it does not infect Machiavelli's own all-out political philosophical attack on classical political philosophy, leading ultimately to a rejection of philosophy as the dietetic way of contemplation exemplified by Socrates or the pursuit of Aristotelian Sophia. It is this infection by what was rejected, a kind of return of the repressed, that Strauss alludes to when he describes Machiavelli as animated by an anti-theological ire, an ire or rage which has, it may be suggested, become characteristic of a whole strain of modern political thought. The first wave of rage directed against Christian political theology was in short order repurposed in a second wave against the bourgeois liberalism that the first wave founded. The paradoxical lowering and raising of standards, lowering from classical conceptions of virtue and raising toward political effectiveness, was domesticated by Locke's labor theory of value, an argument for a basic right to private property. Assumptions that the value of a material good rests with the amount of work someone puts into producing it, rather than its proportionality to the good itself, and that people have inalienable rights to possessive individual ownership, giving individuals direct control of material conditions and marginalizing practices of negotiation and cooperation customary with shared ownership, made possible what Karl Marx termed the bourgeois revolution. This cultural superstructure in the eventual political form of liberalism would not have been possible, nor more or less unjustly stabilized across the long 19th century without an engineered industrial base, unjustly because the rich continued to outpace the poor in their share of the economic pie, but stabilized by increases in the size of the whole pie. The consciousness of the poor was bought off, as it were, by their own smaller increases, which were nevertheless increases. In Herbert Marcuse's deft phrase, technology delivers the goods in a one-dimensionality that overwhelms all others. The inability of exploited workers and consumers to perceive what is happening behind their backs has only been aggravated by the platform virtual economy constructed in the internet, in which users become manipulated by their tools and are uncomplainingly enrolled as unpaid content producers. Last, toward a Tractatus Technologico Politicus. One philosophical way to think about what is going on in the digital political economy might adapt Plato's famous analogy of the cave. In an essay on how to study Spinoza's theological political treatise, Strauss pointed in such a direction with his own arresting version, in which people in the cave had become so prejudiced against ascent to the light of the sun that they dig a deeper pit beneath the cave and withdraw into that pit. Anyone who desired to ascend to the light of the sun, he would first have to try to reach the level of the natural cave, and he would have to invent new and most artificial tools unknown and unnecessary to those who dwelt in the natural cave. He would be a fool. He would never see the light of the sun. He would lose the last vestiges of the memory of the sun if he perversely thought that by inventing his new tools, he had progressed beyond the ancestral cave dwellers. For Strauss, this offers an arresting image of the trajectory of modern political philosophy, and it is not difficult to imagine a divided line interpretation that incorporates technology even more explicitly than Strauss had already done. The cave, or subcave, has been lit with neon lights and the glowing glamour of glittering commerce and the digitalization of experience. Spinoza's Tractatus Theologico Politicus, as complemented by a Tractatus Politicus, which was left unfinished at his death, was the first political philosophical treatise to defend what we now think of as liberalism, a nation-state whose fundamental rationale is to provide peace and security, as argued by Hobbes, not just by subordination of religion to the state, as with Hobbes, but by means of democratic governance, and even more significantly, by a freedom of thought and expression that enables the indefinite production of scientific knowledge and, given the character of modern scientific knowledge, the laissez-faire engineering. It is this obsessively innovating engineering that has replaced political theology with political technology to give us the brightly lit subcave and invites the development, I would propose, of a tractatus technologico politicus. Thank you.